The story of the Great Depression begins not in the dusty fields of the Midwest or the soup kitchens of New York City, but on the polished floors of Wall Street in the autumn of 1929.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the floor.
For much of
As
the
you can see,
1920s,
the markets
America
are
had been
already
riding a
buzzing
wave of
this morning.
economic optimism. The stock market soared, consumer goods flooded into homes, and the idea of prosperity seemed limitless. Radios, automobiles, and household appliances transformed everyday life, and the media painted an image of an unstoppable march toward the American dream. But beneath this glittering surface, there were fractures that few wanted to acknowledge. Banks were lending recklessly, credit was overextended, and a speculative bubble was inflating with every passing day. Investors were gambling on the assumption that prices could only rise, unaware that the edifice they were building on was as fragile as a house of cards. When the first tremors hit, few realized the scale of what was about to unfold. On October 24, 1929, known as Black Thursday, panic struck the stock market. Investors, gripped by fear, began selling off their shares in a desperate attempt to salvage whatever value remained. Prices plummeted, brokers called in loans that could not be repaid, and within hours, millions of dollars evaporated into thin air. The headlines screamed of disaster, but the true impact of the crash was invisible to most Americans at first. What would follow was not just a financial collapse, but a profound social upheaval that would touch nearly every corner of the country. The immediate aftermath of the crash was a wave of bankruptcies that extended far beyond the walls of Wall Street. Banks that had once promised stability were suddenly closing their doors, locking out depositors who had entrusted their life savings to institutions that no longer existed. In small towns across the nation, entire communities were devastated when local banks failed. People who had never speculated on the stock market found themselves penniless, unable to pay for basic necessities. Families who had once considered themselves comfortably middle class were forced to line up for bread and soup, their dignity stripped away by circumstances entirely beyond their control. Hidden among these stories were countless tragedies rarely captured in mainstream history: a small grocer in Nebraska who lost everything because a local bank defaulted, a widow in Ohio left to care for her children with no source of income, and countless farmers who had invested their meager savings in stocks only to see them vanish overnight. These were not just numbers on a balance sheet, these were real lives, upended and shattered in a matter of days. But the economic collapse was not evenly distributed. While some sectors, like banking and finance, were immediately devastated, other industries felt the shock more gradually, prolonging the sense of uncertainty. Factories cut back on production, layoffs became routine, and unemployment began to rise with alarming speed. By the end of 1930, millions of Americans were out of work, their livelihoods destroyed by forces they could neither foresee nor control. It was during this period that the myth of the rugged individual began to confront the brutal reality of systemic failure. Stories that might once have been dismissed as isolated misfortune were now multiplied across the nation, revealing a pattern of economic fragility that no amount of personal effort could overcome. Hidden histories from this period highlight the desperation and ingenuity that people employed to survive. Families who had never before relied on charity learned to navigate the maze of relief programs, neighbors formed informal support networks, and children sometimes went hungry so their parents could eat. These human stories expose a side of the Depression that statistics alone can never convey: the quiet, relentless toll on everyday lives. Even as Americans struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster, policymakers and experts were grappling with the same uncertainty. Theories abounded about the causes of the crash. Some blamed greed and speculation, others argued that underlying structural weaknesses in the economy had made the collapse inevitable. Meanwhile, journalists and photographers were capturing the visible suffering, documenting long lines outside banks, shuttered stores, and deserted factories. Yet much of the human suffering remained hidden, obscured by the distance between Wall Street and the countless small towns where livelihoods had vanished. In retrospect, the 1929 crash was not merely a financial event, it was a cultural and psychological rupture that shook the confidence of a nation. The optimism of the Roaring Twenties was replaced by fear, uncertainty, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Ordinary Americans were forced to confront the fragility of the institutions they had trusted, and the illusion of prosperity was irrevocably shattered. Perhaps most striking in this early period of the Depression is the contrast between perception and reality. Many Americans clung to the belief that the crisis was temporary, that the economy would correct itself, and that life would eventually return to normal. But for those living on the edge, for farmers who lost their land, workers who lost their wages, and families who lost their savings, there was no quick fix. The Great Depression was not a singular event, but the opening chapter of a prolonged and transformative period of hardship, adaptation, and survival. Hidden within these early days of panic and uncertainty are the seeds of stories that would define the decade, stories of resilience, ingenuity, and the often overlooked experiences of those who were not rich, famous, or politically powerful, but who nevertheless bore the brunt of history's harshest blows. It is in these stories, ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, that we begin to understand the true scale and depth of the Great Depression, beyond the headlines, beyond the statistics, and beyond the myth. For millions of Americans, the days after the stock market crash were defined not by headlines or economic theory, but by a harsh new reality, the struggle to survive. Urban streets once bustling with commerce now echoed with the footsteps of men and women searching for work that no longer existed. Breadlines stretched for blocks, and the hum of industry faded into silence as factories shuttered their doors. Families who had once prided themselves on independence found themselves reliant on charity, a bitter pill for those who had always believed in self-sufficiency. The images of soup kitchens and public aid became symbolic of a new era, one in which survival required humility and ingenuity in equal measure. What was happening behind the lines, the quiet, often invisible acts of endurance, reveals a side of the Great Depression rarely captured in mainstream history. It was in these moments, amid long waits for a bowl of soup or a loaf of bread, that the true cost of the economic collapse became personal, intimate, and impossible to ignore. In cities across the country, ordinary Americans were forced to navigate the precarious balance between hunger and dignity. Families rationed what little food they had, stretching ingredients to feed multiple mouths, often sacrificing the needs of the youngest or oldest members to keep others alive. Parents who once provided for their children now faced the shame of dependency, while children were exposed to the harsh realities of poverty at an age when innocence should have shielded them. Yet even in these conditions, life carried on. People found ways to create fleeting moments of normalcy, sharing meals, swapping clothes, and improvising games for children with scraps of paper or broken toys. These acts of resilience were as much a part of the story as the despair, a testament to human adaptability under pressure. Rural areas, often romanticized in popular memory as simple and self-reliant, faced equally devastating challenges. Farmers who had managed to survive the economic turmoil of the 1920s found themselves confronting falling crop prices, mounting debts, and, in some regions, environmental catastrophe. The Dust Bowl, a creeping ecological disaster, compounded the financial strain, turning once fertile farmland into barren wastelands of dust and sand. Families packed their few belongings into battered trucks and wagons, traveling hundreds of miles in search of work, food, and hope. These migrations were perilous, leaving families vulnerable to disease, exploitation, and the constant anxiety of the unknown. Yet for those who stayed behind, survival meant learning to make do with what was at hand, growing gardens in small plots, hunting or foraging, and relying on neighbors for mutual support. Hidden within these stories are countless acts of quiet heroism, a mother nursing multiple children on meager rations, a father walking miles to find temporary work, a community pooling resources to ensure that no one starved completely. In urban centers, the struggle manifested differently but was no less severe. Tenement housing became overcrowded as families were forced to double or triple up to save money. Basic sanitation was often a luxury, and diseases spread easily in crowded conditions. Work opportunities were scarce, and those who did find jobs often faced meager pay, long hours, and dangerous conditions. Men roamed the streets seeking temporary labor, day by day, while women took on piecework or domestic duties to supplement the family income. The social fabric of cities began to fray as economic desperation fueled tensions, but it also gave rise to new forms of solidarity. Mutual aid societies, informal soup kitchens, and neighborhood support networks emerged as lifelines for those forgotten by official channels of relief. Photographs from the period capture both the bleakness of the streets and the faint glimmers of human resilience: children playing in the shadows of boarded-up storefronts, neighbors sharing a loaf of bread, a makeshift garden in a vacant lot. What is often overlooked in the narrative of survival during the Depression is the creativity and resourcefulness that hardship inspired. Clothing was mended until it was almost unrecognizable, and furniture was repaired or repurposed. Leftover food scraps were transformed into meals that stretched the limits of imagination. Families learned to barter, exchanging labor or goods in informal economies that operated just beneath the surface of mainstream commerce. These hidden economies were often essential for survival, yet they left little trace in official records, existing only in memory, letters, and oral histories passed down through generations. In many ways, this improvisational life was as psychologically demanding as it was physically grueling. Every day required planning, ingenuity, and sacrifice, often without assurance that the next meal, paycheck, or night of shelter would materialize. Even amidst deprivation, Americans sought connection, distraction, and hope. Radio broadcasts became a lifeline, offering news, music, and serialized dramas that transported listeners beyond the confines of their daily struggle. Movies, too, provided an escape, allowing families to lose themselves for a few hours in stories of romance, adventure, and triumph. While these forms of entertainment could not alleviate the material hardships, they offered psychological sustenance, a reminder that life could still hold beauty, laughter, and possibility. The contrast between the starkness of breadlines and the glamour of the silver screen was striking, and it highlighted a fundamental tension of the era: the world continued beyond the Depression, even if the suffering it wrought was inescapable for many. Hidden histories from this period reveal moments of ingenuity and community that mainstream accounts often miss. In one documented case, a group of unemployed men in a small Midwestern town created a cooperative garden project to feed dozens of families. In another, women organized sewing circles to produce clothing for children who had grown out of their only garments. Even in the bleakest circumstances, people found ways to assert agency, to maintain dignity, and to preserve a sense of normal life against overwhelming odds. These acts, though often invisible in the grand sweep of history, were the very things that allowed ordinary Americans to endure the Depression, day by day, week by week, year by year. By examining these details, it becomes clear that survival during the Great Depression was not simply about numbers or policy, it was about human experience. The long lines at soup kitchens, the crowded urban apartments, the dust-choked farm fields, and the improvisational daily routines all tell a story of resilience, creativity, and quiet heroism. They reveal a hidden history of the era, one that is far richer, stranger, and more human than headlines or statistics could ever convey. Understanding this reality helps us grasp the full impact of the economic collapse, setting the stage for the deeper exploration of its effects on families, children, and communities that follows in the next chapter of this story. The Great Depression did not affect all members of society equally, and perhaps nowhere was this disparity more poignant than within the family unit. While adults struggled to maintain some semblance of stability, children experienced the upheaval in ways that were often overlooked by history. Schools closed or shortened their terms, leaving children idle or forcing them into work to contribute to family survival. Older children became laborers, delivering newspapers, taking on factory jobs, or even wandering the streets in search of temporary work, while younger ones went without proper nutrition and education. The psychological toll of this era on children was immense. Many grew up too quickly, forced to confront realities that should have been decades away. Diaries and letters from this time reveal a mixture of fear, determination, and adaptability, painting a picture of a generation whose innocence was compressed by economic necessity. The experiences of these children, hidden in the margins of history, tell us as much about the Depression as the statistics on unemployment or breadlines. Families, too, bore the weight of shame and despair. Parents who had once been providers now faced the humiliation of asking for help, relying on charity, or taking what little they could find to keep their children fed. Men who had prided themselves on steady employment wandered aimlessly, often leaving their families emotionally fractured. Women shouldered the burden of household management in impossible conditions, stretching meager rations into full meals and making clothing out of scraps. The emotional strain of these circumstances was compounded by the lack of social safety nets. While programs like the New Deal were still in their infancy, much of the burden of survival fell on informal networks, neighbors, extended families, and local charitable organizations. Within these networks, acts of quiet heroism were common but rarely recorded. A mother who gave her only portion of bread to her child, a father who walked miles to find work, a neighbor who secretly shared clothing or blankets, all these stories constitute a hidden narrative of the Depression, one of resilience and ingenuity amidst relentless hardship. The migration patterns of families during this period also revealed the depth of desperation. Entire households packed their few belongings, leaving behind farms, homes, and communities they had known for generations. The Dust Bowl forced countless families from the Midwest to head westward in search of work and more fertile land, while others abandoned urban areas where unemployment had reached crushing levels. These migrations were perilous journeys, filled with uncertainty and danger. Children often witnessed suffering on a scale that should have been unimaginable, neighbors dying of illness due to poor nutrition, families displaced by eviction, and communities fragmented by economic necessity. Yet in these extreme conditions, families found ways to adapt. Stories survive of parents teaching children survival skills, of siblings taking care of one another, and of communities forming impromptu schools and play areas to maintain a semblance of normal childhood. These hidden acts of resilience were essential, not just for survival, but for preserving the bonds of family and community that the Depression sought to strain and break. It is tempting to imagine that children's experience of the Depression was uniformly bleak, yet there were unexpected forms of creativity and coping. Children found ways to play, to laugh, and to assert their agency despite the harshness surrounding them. Games were invented from scraps of wood and cloth, toys were fashioned from discarded objects, and stories became a means of escape. In some towns, children organized informal cooperatives to trade goods, help their families, or assist neighbors, learning at an early age the value of collaboration and resourcefulness. These small acts of ingenuity and defiance against hardship are part of the hidden history of the Depression, illuminating a side of childhood that official records and adult-focused narratives often fail to capture. The emotional and social toll on families was profound. Traditional family roles were disrupted, as the pressures of survival forced men and women into new labor patterns or forced children into adult responsibilities. Marriages strained under the weight of financial insecurity, and some families fractured entirely, unable to cope with the relentless stress. Yet for many, the Depression also fostered extraordinary resilience and solidarity. Families that might have been fragile in better times learned to function as tight-knit units, sharing scarce resources, making collective decisions, and supporting one another emotionally in ways that left lasting impressions. Oral histories collected decades later recount how these experiences shaped character, instilling values of thrift, resourcefulness, and compassion, while also leaving scars of anxiety, loss, and grief that persisted long after the economy recovered. Hidden stories abound of families who creatively navigated the Depression. One mother in rural Kansas reportedly taught her children to make clothes from flour sacks, while a father in New York City built makeshift furniture from crates scavenged from abandoned warehouses. Entire communities engaged in mutual aid, sharing meals, providing temporary housing, or pooling labor to ensure no one family went completely without. These acts, though small, were monumental in their impact, preserving both the material and emotional survival of those involved. The Depression was not only an economic crisis, it was a crucible in which ordinary people demonstrated extraordinary fortitude. As we examine the experiences of children and families, a larger truth emerges: survival during the Great Depression was not merely a matter of endurance, but of adaptation and ingenuity. The hidden, everyday acts of courage, sacrifice, and creativity provide a window into the human dimension of this historical moment. While the statistics of unemployment and poverty are stark, they cannot capture the lived reality of families navigating hunger, displacement, and uncertainty on a daily basis. By understanding these intimate stories, we gain a more complete picture of what life was really like during the Depression, not just the broad strokes of economic collapse, but the personal, emotional, and social landscapes that shaped the generation who lived through it. In the end, the story of families and children during the Great Depression is one of contrasts: despair and hope, deprivation and creativity, suffering and resilience. These hidden histories remind us that even in the darkest times, human beings find ways to survive, adapt, and preserve dignity. They lay the foundation for the next chapter of the Great Depression, in which rural communities face ecological catastrophe and urban populations confront the harsh realities of life in an unforgiving landscape. By following these threads, we begin to see the full tapestry of the Depression, not just as an economic event, but as a profoundly human one, marked by struggle, ingenuity, and the quiet courage of ordinary people. While urban families struggled with unemployment and crowded living conditions, rural America faced an entirely different, yet equally devastating set of challenges. The economic collapse of the late 1920s intersected with a profound environmental crisis, creating a perfect storm that would drive thousands from their homes and leave others clinging desperately to the land. The Dust Bowl, as it came to be called, was more than a meteorological phenomenon. It was a human catastrophe, a visible reminder that even the most seemingly stable livelihoods were vulnerable. Years of intensive farming, combined with drought and high winds, stripped the topsoil from the plains, turning once fertile farmland into sweeping landscapes of dust and ruin. Crops failed, livestock perished, and families who had tilled the same soil for generations found themselves facing not just financial collapse, but the literal disappearance of the land they depended upon. The stories of this period, often relegated to statistics or brief newspaper articles, reveal the profound human toll of ecological disaster intersecting with economic collapse. For families in the Dust Bowl states, Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and parts of Colorado and New Mexico, daily life became a battle against both hunger and the elements. Dust storms swept through homes, leaving rooms coated in fine, choking sand. Children developed respiratory illnesses, and adults faced chronic fatigue from endless work in infertile fields. Families tried to salvage what little they could, planting small gardens that often succumbed to drought, trapping game, or rationing meager supplies of flour, beans, and corn. The psychological strain was enormous. The land that had once promised security now felt like an adversary. Hidden stories from this era highlight the ingenuity and resilience of ordinary people. One family in Kansas reportedly rigged a makeshift windbreak from old fence posts and burlap sacks to protect their small garden, while another built a water catchment system from scavenged barrels to survive an unusually dry summer. These adaptations, though modest, were essential to survival and reflected a desperate creativity born from necessity. The economic implications of the Dust Bowl were devastating. Farmers were unable to sell crops or repay debts, leading to widespread foreclosures. Bank failures were felt even more acutely in rural areas, where families often had deep, personal ties to local institutions. When banks foreclosed on farms, entire communities were destabilized. Generations of knowledge, labor, and tradition were uprooted in a matter of months, leaving a lasting scar on the cultural fabric of rural America. The migration that followed was immense. Families packed their belongings into trucks, wagons, and even handcarts, heading westward in search of employment, fertile land, or simply a chance at survival. They became the so-called Okies, a term that would come to symbolize displacement, resilience, and social marginalization. Hidden histories from these migrations are striking: families sleeping in abandoned cars, children walking miles through desolate terrain, and communities forming ad hoc settlements along highways. These journeys were perilous, yet they were also imbued with a profound sense of hope, a belief that somewhere, there might exist land, work, and stability. The arrival of migrants in places like California brought new challenges. Competition for scarce jobs created tension between locals and newcomers, and many migrant families found themselves living in makeshift camps, often with little access to clean water, sanitation, or healthcare. Employers exploited their desperation, paying below subsistence wages or demanding grueling labor in fields and orchards. Yet even within these marginalized communities, acts of solidarity and cooperation emerged. Families shared food, clothing, and labor, and children continued to attend improvised schools where they could, preserving a sense of continuity amid upheaval. These hidden acts of community resilience demonstrate that even in conditions of extreme deprivation, humans seek connection and support, forging social bonds that become as essential to survival as food or shelter. Government intervention during this period, though significant, often lagged behind the scale of the crisis. Programs like the Soil Conservation Service attempted to combat erosion through innovative techniques such as crop rotation, tree planting, and the promotion of sustainable farming practices. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men to work on reforestation and soil preservation projects, but these initiatives could only address part of the problem. Many families continued to struggle, dependent on charity, informal networks, or the slim chance of employment in more prosperous regions. Rare photographs and letters from this time reveal the stark contrasts between official programs and lived reality. While government trucks delivered supplies and built terraces to prevent erosion, families remained exposed to relentless dust storms, hunger, and illness, living day by day in uncertain conditions. The Dust Bowl also had profound cultural implications. Music, literature, and art began to reflect the experiences of displaced rural populations, capturing the suffering and resilience of those who endured environmental and economic catastrophe. Photographers like Dorothea Lange documented the lives of migrant families, showing faces lined with dust, worry, and determination. Writers like John Steinbeck chronicled the migrations and social tensions, offering an intimate glimpse into the human consequences of ecological collapse. These cultural artifacts preserve a hidden layer of history often overshadowed by broader economic narratives, reminding us that the Depression was not just about numbers or policies. It was about the lived experiences of individuals grappling with forces far beyond their control. In understanding the rural plight during the Great Depression, it becomes clear that survival required a combination of ingenuity, perseverance, and sheer physical endurance. Families adapted to environmental destruction, navigated economic uncertainty, and maintained social cohesion in the face of relentless hardship. These hidden stories, small acts of courage, creativity, and community, illustrate a side of the Depression that is often overlooked in mainstream accounts. They remind us that history is not merely written in statistics and policy, but in the day-to-day choices, sacrifices, and resilience of ordinary people confronting extraordinary adversity. By examining these rural experiences, we gain insight into the broader human impact of the Great Depression. The struggles of farming families, the perilous migrations, and the survival strategies they employed reveal the depth of hardship and the lengths to which people went to preserve life and dignity. These hidden histories lay the foundation for the next chapter, in which urban populations face their own unique challenges, navigating the crowded streets, informal economies, and social upheaval that characterized city life during one of America's darkest decades. While rural families battled dust, drought, and foreclosures, urban America faced a different but equally unforgiving reality. Cities that had once pulsed with energy, commerce, and possibility now carried a quiet, almost eerie weight. Factory chimneys that had belched smoke day and night fell silent. Storefronts closed, leaving windows dark and streets strangely empty. The hum of city life, once a constant backdrop to the dreams and ambitions of millions, was replaced by long lines at soup kitchens, makeshift shelters, and the constant shuffle of the unemployed searching for work. Urban life during the Great Depression was defined by both deprivation and adaptation, a complex interplay between the visible suffering of the streets and the hidden, often ingenious ways people managed to survive. The first challenge for many city dwellers was housing. Renters faced evictions when they could no longer afford their apartments, and families were forced to double or triple up with relatives or neighbors. Tenements, already cramped and unsanitary, became even more crowded. Families navigated these conditions with creativity and caution, setting up makeshift partitions, sharing cooking equipment, and improvising ways to preserve some semblance of privacy and dignity. Some turned to abandoned buildings, alleyways, or informal Hoovervilles, shantytown settlements named derisively after President Herbert Hoover, for shelter. These communities, though precarious and often dangerous, became hubs of mutual aid and cooperation. Neighbors shared food, clothing, and sometimes work opportunities, forming networks of support that were invisible to official records but essential for survival. Unemployment was a constant specter in urban life. Men and women wandered streets and public squares in search of day labor, often without success. Factories that once provided stable employment had drastically cut production or closed entirely, leaving workers desperate and demoralized. For many, finding work required resourcefulness, persistence, and a willingness to take on jobs far below their skill level or pay expectations. Women increasingly entered the labor force, taking domestic jobs, laundry work, or other informal employment to support their families. Children were sometimes pulled out of school to contribute, selling newspapers, shining shoes, or running errands. These adaptations, though necessary, carried significant social and emotional consequences, reshaping family structures and traditional gender roles in profound ways. Amid these challenges, urban communities developed inventive survival strategies. Informal economies flourished as people bartered goods, shared meals, or provided services for mutual benefit. Street vendors, cooperative gardens, and small-scale bartering networks became lifelines for those overlooked by formal relief programs. Even the arts played a role in everyday survival. Public theaters, free concerts, and community gatherings offered temporary escape from the relentless pressures of daily life, providing hope and sustaining morale. Children played in alleys, using scraps of wood and cardboard for games, while adults created social clubs or organized cooperative workshops to share skills and resources. These acts of ingenuity and community cohesion were hidden histories of the Depression, often overshadowed by dramatic images of hunger and despair, yet equally essential to understanding how ordinary people endured the era. The streets themselves were a theater of contrasts. On one hand, the stark deprivation was undeniable, men with hollow eyes begging for work, women clutching children while waiting for charity, and teenagers wandering aimlessly in search of odd jobs. On the other hand, the same streets were alive with ingenuity, humor, and solidarity. People found ways to entertain themselves despite scarcity, inventing games, staging impromptu performances, or finding small pleasures in shared meals and storytelling. Photographs from this period capture the juxtaposition vividly: a child laughing with a friend while dusting off their only shoes, neighbors sharing a loaf of bread, a makeshift shelter adorned with a simple curtain to preserve a sense of dignity. These images remind us that urban hardship was not only a story of deprivation but also a story of human resilience. City life during the Depression also exposed hidden inequalities and social tensions. Competition for scarce jobs fueled resentment between longtime residents and newcomers, while racial and ethnic minorities often faced discrimination in employment, housing, and relief programs. Social hierarchies were disrupted as everyone, from skilled laborers to professionals, struggled to adapt to the new economic reality. Despite these tensions, urban communities frequently demonstrated remarkable solidarity. Neighborhood committees organized food distribution, parents swapped child care duties, and entire communities rallied around individuals in need. These cooperative networks, largely invisible to the outside world, were critical to survival and illustrate a hidden dimension of urban life during the Depression, a social ecosystem operating beneath the surface of public consciousness, guided by necessity, ingenuity, and empathy. The media of the time captured both the despair and the resilience of city life, though often with a focus on dramatic images: lines at soup kitchens, men sleeping in parks, shantytowns sprawled across city edges. What is less frequently acknowledged are the private, quiet moments of endurance, families conserving what little they had, neighbors pooling resources, and individuals finding ways to maintain dignity despite relentless hardship. These hidden histories, woven into the fabric of urban life, provide a fuller picture of what survival truly looked like. Urban America during the Great Depression was a world of contrasts, deprivation and ingenuity, despair and solidarity, visible suffering and hidden resilience. It was a place where every day was a negotiation between necessity and dignity, where the human spirit was tested in both subtle and profound ways. By understanding the urban experience, we see how the Great Depression reshaped social structures, challenged traditional family roles, and inspired creative survival strategies. The lessons from these streets, of community, resourcefulness, and human endurance, set the stage for examining the broader struggles of work, wages, and labor in the next chapter, where Americans sought not just survival but also dignity and opportunity in the face of systemic collapse. As urban and rural communities struggled to survive, the question of work became central to the everyday lives of millions of Americans. Employment, once taken for granted, had become a scarce and precious commodity, and even those lucky enough to find jobs often faced brutal conditions and inadequate pay. Factories, shops, and offices that had once promised stability were shuttered or operating at minimal capacity, leaving workers desperate and disoriented. For men, the loss of work carried a profound social and psychological weight. Employment was not merely a source of income, it was tied to identity, pride, and a sense of purpose. Losing a job meant more than financial hardship, it often meant shame, frustration, and a daily struggle to maintain dignity while supporting a family on the margins of survival. Women increasingly entered the labor force, taking jobs that were often poorly paid and physically demanding. Domestic work, laundry, and piecework became common sources of income, particularly in urban centers. Women were frequently expected to manage both household responsibilities and income-generating work, creating a relentless cycle of labor with little reward or recognition. Children, too, were often compelled to contribute, working in factories, selling newspapers, or running errands to supplement family income. These hidden stories of labor underscore the pervasive reach of economic collapse, affecting every member of society and reshaping traditional family and social roles. Unemployment rates skyrocketed, leaving millions wandering streets and public spaces in search of temporary work. Day laborers congregated near factories, construction sites, and warehouses, hoping for a single day's employment that might provide a meal or a few dollars. Work was often physically grueling, poorly compensated, and uncertain, yet the determination of those seeking employment was relentless. Oral histories from this era capture both the desperation and ingenuity of workers, men sleeping in alleys to save travel costs, women walking miles with children in tow to reach potential jobs, and teenagers finding odd work to support their families. These efforts highlight not only economic necessity but also the extraordinary human drive to survive, even under the harshest circumstances. The Depression also saw the rise of informal and exploitative labor arrangements. Employers, aware of the oversupply of labor, often paid below subsistence wages or demanded work in dangerous conditions, knowing that desperate workers had little recourse. In cities, men lined up for construction or manufacturing jobs that might last only a few hours, while in rural areas, migrant laborers worked long days in fields, often sleeping in tents or cars and eating minimally. Union organizing became increasingly important, as workers sought collective bargaining to improve pay, hours, and safety. Strikes, sit-ins, and protests emerged as acts of both survival and resistance, yet they were often met with hostility from authorities or public skepticism. The tension between laborers and employers reflected the broader social upheaval of the era, a confrontation between human need and systemic inequity that defined the lived experience of work during the Depression. Amid these struggles, hidden stories of resilience and ingenuity shine through. Families pooled labor to survive. Neighbors babysat each other's children so parents could work, siblings took turns performing odd jobs, and community groups organized cooperative workshops or shared skills to increase earning potential. Women's networks, often overlooked in mainstream histories, became crucial for survival. They shared tips for maximizing household efficiency, finding employment, or supplementing incomes with sewing, laundry, or small-scale trade. These informal labor strategies were essential for maintaining life and dignity, yet they rarely appear in statistics or official records, leaving a hidden layer of the depression largely invisible to future generations. Rural laborers faced their own unique challenges. Migrant workers, displaced by the Dust Bowl or economic collapse, traveled vast distances in search of work in agriculture or industry. These journeys were grueling, and opportunities were scarce. Families slept in overcrowded camps or makeshift shelters, often with inadequate food or sanitation. Children were pressed into labor alongside adults, both contributing to survival and learning resilience under extreme hardship. These conditions expose the fragility of the social safety net, the inequities in employment practices, and the stark contrast between survival and subsistence. Yet, even in these dire circumstances, communities formed networks of support, sharing food, shelter, and labor to keep as many people afloat as possible. The work of the Depression era was not simply a matter of physical survival, it carried profound emotional and social consequences. Losing work, or being underemployed, undermined personal identity and family stability. Successive failures to secure employment often resulted in despair, depression, and, in some cases, family breakdown. Yet within these struggles, extraordinary human resilience persisted. Stories of persistence, creativity, and solidarity abound, a father repairing shoes to sell in a makeshift stall, a mother creating a small garment business from home, children inventing ways to earn small sums without formal employment. These narratives illustrate the depth of human adaptation and determination, revealing the hidden labor history that shaped the Depression-era experience. The interplay between unemployment, underemployment, and survival also set the stage for broader social and political responses. As the scale of economic distress became undeniable, relief programs and government intervention gradually emerged to stabilize employment and provide temporary work. Projects like the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps offered jobs while simultaneously improving public infrastructure. Yet these initiatives, while crucial, were only partial solutions, and millions continued to rely on informal labor networks and day-to-day ingenuity to survive. Hidden histories from these programs reveal both successes and failures, the creation of roads, bridges, and public buildings alongside persistent gaps in access for marginalized groups. Ultimately, the story of work and wages during the Great Depression is one of contrasts: extreme hardship and perseverance, exploitation and ingenuity, despair and resilience. Employment became more than a means of survival, it was a measure of identity, pride, and social participation. Understanding the lived realities of work during this era, both the visible struggles and the hidden, often overlooked acts of adaptation, allows us to grasp the human dimension of economic collapse. It also sets the stage for the next chapter, where government intervention, social programs, and policy responses begin to reshape the landscape of American life, offering hope, relief, and new opportunities amidst ongoing hardship. By the early 1930s, the scale of economic collapse in the United States demanded a response that went beyond individual resilience and informal networks. Families, workers, and entire communities were struggling to survive, and it became increasingly clear that systemic intervention was necessary. Franklin D. Roosevelt's election in 1932 ushered in a new era of government involvement in everyday life. The New Deal, as his series of policies and programs came to be known, promised not just relief but hope, an unprecedented attempt to stabilize the economy, provide jobs, and restore confidence. Yet the reality of these programs was complex, often messy, and frequently fell short of the idealized image projected in newspapers and propaganda. Hidden histories reveal the tension between intention and execution, the gaps in coverage, and the lives profoundly affected, sometimes positively, sometimes disappointingly, by government intervention. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, WPA, became emblematic of the New Deal's reach. Thousands of unemployed men and women were placed in work relief programs that built roads, bridges, schools, and parks, or engaged in environmental conservation. For many, these programs offered not just income, but a sense of purpose and dignity. Men who had once roamed streets in search of work were given steady employment, new skills, and the knowledge that they were contributing to something tangible. Yet, for all their successes, these programs were not without flaws. Women and minorities were often excluded or relegated to lower-paying, less visible work, while bureaucratic inefficiencies sometimes delayed assistance for months. Hidden within these stories are the personal accounts that reveal both pride and frustration: a young man learning carpentry while living in a crowded CCC camp, a mother receiving modest relief for her family but struggling to supplement it through informal labor, and communities benefiting from infrastructure projects yet frustrated by uneven access and favoritism. The New Deal also attempted to stabilize the broader economy through banking reform and social welfare initiatives. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, guaranteed bank deposits, helping restore confidence in financial institutions. Social Security, though limited in its initial scope, provided the first federal safety net for the elderly and unemployed. Yet these programs, while groundbreaking, were often complicated to access, and many who needed help most, particularly migrant workers, rural laborers, and African Americans, found themselves excluded. The contrast between the promise of the New Deal and the lived experience of everyday Americans underscores a recurring theme: policy alone could not erase the human suffering wrought by years of economic collapse. It could, however, provide a scaffold on which survival strategies, resilience, and ingenuity could flourish. Relief efforts also extended into the cultural and creative sectors, often overlooked in traditional economic histories. The Federal Art Project, part of the WPA, employed artists, photographers, and writers to document the struggles and achievements of ordinary Americans. Photographers like Dorothea Lange captured haunting images of displaced families, Dust Bowl migrants, and urban workers, creating a visual archive that revealed the hidden dimensions of hardship. Writers, too, were supported to chronicle life in both rural and urban communities, producing stories, reports, and novels that reflected the lived realities of the era. These initiatives were more than mere employment; they were a way of preserving human dignity and recording history as it unfolded. They allowed individuals to contribute meaningfully, even when economic survival was precarious, and left a lasting cultural legacy that continues to shape our understanding of the Great Depression. The New Deal's impact was not uniform, however, and its limitations were often stark. Bureaucratic inefficiency, local political favoritism, and societal prejudice sometimes meant that aid was unevenly distributed. Some families waited months for assistance, while others were denied entirely. African Americans, migrant workers, and women frequently faced discrimination, limiting their access to programs meant to alleviate hardship. In rural areas, relief could be slow to arrive, delayed by distance, poor infrastructure, or local resistance. Yet even amid these challenges, the New Deal created openings for survival, opportunity, and community building. For those fortunate enough to access it, the programs provided not just food or wages, but a sense that the nation had not abandoned them entirely, that their suffering was seen, acknowledged, and addressed, imperfectly though it might have been. Hidden histories from this period also reveal acts of negotiation, resistance, and creativity within the New Deal framework. Communities sometimes lobbied aggressively for projects, redirecting resources to meet local needs. Individuals adapted programs to their advantage, participating in relief initiatives while simultaneously engaging in informal labor or barter to supplement insufficient wages. These stories demonstrate that government intervention was not a top-down imposition, but a dynamic interaction between policy and human agency. Ordinary Americans did not simply receive aid, they reshaped it, resisted its shortcomings, and used it to build a fragile yet vital bridge between despair and stability. The New Deal also shifted perceptions of government's role in daily life. For decades, the idea that the federal government might directly intervene in citizens' welfare was controversial, even radical. Yet as programs reached across the nation, touching families, workers, and communities previously left to fend for themselves, attitudes began to shift. Government became not just a distant authority, but a participant in everyday survival, a factor in the lives of ordinary Americans navigating an unprecedented economic crisis. These shifts, both practical and ideological, set the stage for the post-Depression era, influencing labor rights, social welfare, and public expectations of government responsibility for decades to come. Ultimately, the New Deal era highlights the complex interplay between policy and lived experience. While programs like the CCC, WPA, FDIC, and Social Security offered relief, employment, and hope, they also revealed the limitations of bureaucracy, bias, and incomplete implementation. Hidden within the larger narrative of recovery are countless personal stories, of pride, frustration, creativity, and resilience, that illuminate the human dimension of government intervention. Americans were not passive recipients of policy, they were active participants, adapting, negotiating, and surviving within a landscape of both support and insufficiency. The New Deal, in all its complexity, reshaped not just the economy, but the social fabric of the nation, offering temporary relief and long-term lessons that continue to resonate. By examining the realities of government intervention, we see the nuanced impact of the New Deal, programs that offered life-saving assistance, fostered community resilience, and preserved dignity, even as gaps, exclusions, and bureaucratic challenges limited their reach. These efforts provide a critical transition into the next chapter, where, despite hardship, Americans turned to culture, creativity, and shared experiences to survive, escape, and endure in ways that were both unexpected and profoundly human. Even amidst the relentless hardship of the Great Depression, Americans found ways to preserve their spirits, to create meaning, and to seek moments of joy. Culture became both a refuge and a subtle act of resistance against the crushing weight of poverty. Music, literature, art, and entertainment offered temporary escapes from the harsh realities of daily life, while also reflecting the lived experiences of millions struggling to survive. In homes, radio broadcasts brought news, music, and serialized dramas, connecting families to a broader world beyond the crowded tenements or dusty plains. Families gathered around crackling radios to listen to the latest soap operas, comedies, and big band performances, experiencing laughter and drama in a way that momentarily transported them from the anxieties of hunger and uncertainty. The radio, a relatively new technology, became a lifeline, offering both information and solace, and shaping a shared national consciousness in a time of widespread isolation. Music, in particular, provided comfort, inspiration, and a form of collective memory. Folk singers, blues artists, and jazz musicians chronicled the struggles of ordinary Americans, their lyrics capturing the nuances of hardship with striking honesty. Woody Guthrie's songs told the stories of Dust Bowl migrants, while other performers highlighted the challenges of urban poverty and labor struggles. These works served not just as entertainment, but as historical records of lived experience, preserving voices that might otherwise have been lost. In crowded city apartments, rural shacks, and makeshift migrant camps, music offered both a rhythm for daily survival and a reminder that beauty and creativity could endure even in desperate circumstances. Hidden histories reveal that many of these performances were improvised, a mother singing to her children to soothe hunger pangs, a migrant laborer playing a makeshift guitar at dusk, or small community gatherings in backyards and town halls where neighbors shared songs, stories, and laughter. Art also flourished, sometimes in unexpected ways. Government-sponsored programs like the Federal Art Project of the Works Progress Administration employed artists to create murals, sculptures, and illustrations that both documented the Depression and celebrated American resilience. Dorothea Lange's photography immortalized the faces of suffering and endurance, a mother clutching her children amid a Dust Bowl landscape, a migrant family huddled in a makeshift shelter, workers repairing roads and bridges. These images became iconic symbols of the era, but they also served a deeper purpose, capturing the hidden realities of ordinary life, preserving dignity amidst deprivation, and reminding viewers that behind statistics were human beings navigating extraordinary challenges. Writers, too, chronicled the Depression with unparalleled nuance. John Steinbeck's novels, reportage, and short stories depicted migrant struggles, urban hardships, and the emotional landscapes of poverty with empathy and precision. These creative works offered both critique and solace, providing audiences with narratives that validated their experiences while inspiring hope for change. Even within families, creativity became a tool for survival and emotional endurance. Children fashioned toys from scraps of wood, cloth, and wire, turning discarded objects into playthings that entertained and distracted them from hunger and loss. Parents invented games to occupy young minds, using imagination as a shield against the harshness outside. Homemade plays, puppet shows, and neighborhood storytelling sessions allowed communities to maintain a sense of normalcy, laughter, and cohesion, even when basic necessities were scarce. These small, often undocumented acts of cultural ingenuity illustrate the hidden ways in which ordinary Americans refused to let the Depression extinguish joy, creativity, and human connection. Film and theater also played a critical role, offering a temporary escape into worlds of glamour, romance, and adventure. Movie theaters, even in economically depressed areas, remained gathering spaces where families could lose themselves for an hour or two in stories far removed from their daily struggles. Musicals, comedies, and action films allowed audiences to experience triumph and excitement vicariously, offering hope that challenges could be overcome and that life might yet hold pleasure, beauty, and possibility. Similarly, local theaters and traveling performers brought art to small towns and urban neighborhoods, fostering a sense of community and collective participation. These cultural interventions, both large and small, demonstrate how the human spirit persisted, seeking light even in a world darkened by economic collapse. Hidden in these creative endeavors were acts of subtle defiance and empowerment. While the government focused on economic relief, Americans found ways to assert control over their environment, to create meaning and dignity in lives constrained by circumstance. Folk music, improvised art, and neighborhood entertainment were not mere distractions, they were tools for survival, emotional resilience, and community cohesion. They provided a sense of identity, continuity, and agency that official programs could not always supply, bridging the gap between deprivation and hope. This rich cultural life also intersected with political awareness and social commentary. Art, literature, and music frequently highlighted inequality, injustice, and the daily struggles of ordinary people. They preserved hidden histories that might otherwise have been lost, documenting the realities of life during the Depression for future generations. In many ways, the era's cultural output was as vital to understanding the Great Depression as economic statistics or government records, offering insight into how individuals and communities navigated both suffering and survival. Ultimately, the story of culture during the Great Depression is one of contrasts, deprivation and creativity, despair and resilience, struggle and beauty. Americans endured unimaginable hardship, yet they continued to create, to share, and to find joy in fleeting moments. Music, art, literature, and theater were not luxuries, they were lifelines, preserving identity, community, and hope in a time of profound uncertainty. By examining this hidden dimension of the Depression, we gain a more complete understanding of the era, one that celebrates not only survival but also the indomitable human spirit that refused to be silenced or defeated, even in the darkest of times. While much of the story of the Great Depression centers on survival, resilience, and ingenuity, another, darker layer emerged beneath the surface of everyday life. Desperation bred not only innovation and solidarity but also crime, corruption, and moral compromise. As ordinary Americans struggled to feed their families, find work, and maintain dignity, some were forced into acts they would never have considered in more prosperous times. Theft, fraud, and black market dealings became survival strategies for those on the margins, while organized crime seized opportunities created by economic chaos and weakened enforcement. Hidden histories reveal a world in which legality and morality often blurred, and where the struggle to survive sometimes demanded actions that defied conventional notions of right and wrong. Urban centers were hotspots for these pressures. Crowded cities, with tens of thousands unemployed, provided both need and opportunity. Soup lines and relief offices became scenes not just of charity but also of subtle manipulation, bribery, and fraud. Desperate individuals sometimes falsified applications for relief, exaggerated family size, or created false identities to access scarce resources. While such acts were often viewed with moral disdain, they were frequently matters of life and death. Similarly, petty theft and shoplifting rose in many urban areas, reflecting the impossible choices facing families with children going hungry. Newspapers of the era occasionally sensationalized these crimes, framing them as moral failings, but hidden history suggests a more nuanced reality. Survival itself became a moral calculus under extreme deprivation. At the same time, organized crime exploited the instability of the period. Bootlegging, gambling, and racketeering, often remnants of Prohibition-era networks, became intertwined with economic survival strategies. Criminal organizations sometimes provided jobs, food, or temporary housing to those left destitute by the Depression, creating a shadow economy that filled gaps left by legitimate institutions. For many marginalized communities, this blurred the lines between legality and necessity, illustrating how systemic failure at the economic and governmental levels forced people to navigate morally ambiguous terrain. Figures who became infamous during this period, Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, and others, captured public imagination not simply as criminals but as symbols of rebellion against a society that seemed indifferent to the suffering of ordinary citizens. Their exploits, romanticized in newspapers and folklore, highlight the paradox of the Depression, that desperation could simultaneously inspire both ingenuity and lawlessness. Rural areas faced their own forms of corruption and crime. Land speculators, banks, and local officials sometimes exploited farmers, taking advantage of foreclosures, loan defaults, and mismanaged relief programs. Stories of families losing ancestral land to manipulative contracts or unscrupulous agents were common, revealing how structural inequities amplified the human cost of the Depression. Migrant workers traveling to find seasonal work often faced predatory employers, wage theft, and unsafe living conditions, forcing them to adopt survival strategies that straddled legality and necessity. The hidden histories of these regions underscore a central tension of the era: the fragility of trust, both in institutions and between individuals, and the constant need to navigate a world in which conventional rules were often suspended by economic desperation. Children, too, were drawn into this shadowed side of survival. Many became pickpockets, ran errands for illegal operations, or worked in informal economies that skirted legality. For some, these activities were temporary, forced by hunger or family necessity. For others, they became formative experiences, shaping how they understood authority, fairness, and survival. Communities often tolerated, or even facilitated, these acts as part of an unspoken moral compromise. Sometimes bending rules was the only way to ensure that a family ate, a neighbor survived, or a child had shelter. Hidden histories of youth involvement in crime reveal a society in which systemic neglect forced the young to navigate ethical dilemmas that were far beyond their years. Corruption also infiltrated relief programs. Officials sometimes siphoned funds, allocated resources unfairly, or required bribes to access aid. For the families dependent on these programs, such corruption added layers of frustration and mistrust, making the already difficult task of survival even more complicated. Yet, these acts also illustrate human adaptability. Communities develop strategies to navigate or circumvent corrupt systems, creating informal networks, barter arrangements, or collective action to ensure that aid reached those in need despite official obstacles. In these ways, the Great Depression was not only a story of poverty but also a story of negotiation, improvisation, and the moral compromises that extraordinary hardship demanded. Ultimately, the intertwining of crime, corruption, and survival during the Depression illuminates the complex human realities often hidden behind statistics. Desperation forced individuals to make difficult moral choices, blurred the line between right and wrong, and created shadow networks that helped sustain life in the absence of formal support. It also revealed the fragility of social and institutional trust, highlighting how ordinary people adapted to systems that were failing them at every level. These hidden histories challenge simplified narratives of good versus evil, showing instead a world in which morality, necessity, and survival were entangled in ways that were often contradictory but profoundly human. Urban and rural, adult and child, individual and community, all navigated this landscape of moral ambiguity. While mainstream accounts often focus on breadlines, work programs, and visible suffering, the stories of crime and corruption reveal the hidden pressures and choices that defined life for many during the Great Depression. Understanding these dimensions allows a more complete and nuanced view of the era, one that captures not only endurance and ingenuity but also the ethical and social complexities of surviving amid widespread deprivation. It sets the stage for exploring the final years of the Depression, where slow recovery, lingering hardship, and eventual hope converge, bringing both lessons and closure to this extraordinary period of American history. By the mid to late 1930s, signs of recovery began to emerge, though the path was uneven, slow, and fraught with lingering hardship. The economy gradually stabilized, aided in part by the ongoing effects of the New Deal, shifts in industrial production, and the slow return of consumer confidence. Factories began to hum once more, and employment programs continued to put millions of Americans back to work. Yet recovery was not uniform, and the scars of the preceding years remained visible across families, communities, and landscapes. For many, the Great Depression was not a distant historical event but a living memory etched into the rhythm of daily life, influencing behavior, social expectations, and the way people approached risk, work, and survival for decades to come. The lingering effects were most pronounced among those who had experienced the greatest deprivation. Rural communities that had suffered through the Dust Bowl, crop failures, and foreclosures often faced years of rebuilding. Families returned to farms that were depleted of topsoil, laboring tirelessly to restore fertility and secure some measure of economic stability. Migrant families who had traveled west in search of work often settled in makeshift communities or urban slums, bringing with them memories of displacement and resilience that would inform their children's upbringing. Urban neighborhoods bore the marks of overcrowding, poverty, and inadequate infrastructure, which did not disappear with the first signs of economic improvement. The psychological impact of prolonged uncertainty, anxiety, caution, and heightened resourcefulness was a quiet but pervasive legacy, shaping a generation's approach to family, finances, and opportunity. At the same time, cultural and social memory began to solidify. The photographs, literature, and music of the Depression years became enduring records of survival and resilience, capturing both suffering and ingenuity. Families recounted stories of shared meals, improvised entertainment, and acts of solidarity, passing down lessons of thrift, creativity, and perseverance. These narratives, preserved in diaries, letters, and oral histories, became part of the social fabric, influencing values and norms well beyond the decade. Communities celebrated recovery cautiously, aware that economic stability could be fleeting, yet finding pride in the small victories: a restored farm, a newly employed family member, or a neighborhood strengthened by collective hardship. Government programs also left a lasting imprint. Social Security, the FDIC, and labor protections initiated during the New Deal continued to provide safety nets and frameworks for employment rights, fundamentally changing expectations of government responsibility. The experience of the Depression reshaped the social contract. Citizens now understood that systemic failures could occur, but also that intervention, while imperfect, could mitigate the worst effects. These institutional legacies were complemented by informal strategies developed during the years of hardship: community networks, barter systems, and cooperative initiatives that continued to shape local economies and social cohesion long after the economy officially improved. The hidden histories of these adaptations reveal a lasting lesson. Resilience was not only personal but collective, a blend of ingenuity, solidarity, and institutional support. Recovery was also accompanied by reflection and reinterpretation of the past. For many Americans, the hardships endured became a source of moral instruction, shaping attitudes toward work, savings, and risk. Parents who had experienced hunger and deprivation instilled values of thrift and resourcefulness in their children, emphasizing the importance of preparation, education, and community. These lessons were both pragmatic and psychological, reflecting the deep imprint that prolonged economic crisis leaves on memory and behavior. Hidden within these stories are subtle narratives of pride, shame, ingenuity, and caution that reveal the complex human consequences of surviving extreme hardship. Recovery was thus not merely economic, it was cultural, emotional, and social, leaving traces that extended across generations. Yet even in recovery, inequality persisted. Many who had suffered the most continued to face obstacles, whether in rural areas still recovering from environmental disasters or in urban centers where job competition remained fierce. Marginalized communities, particularly African Americans, migrants, and women, often benefited less from official programs, leaving them dependent on informal networks and personal ingenuity for survival. These realities complicate the narrative of recovery, reminding us that while the economy improved, the human consequences of the Depression continued to shape everyday life. Understanding this complexity allows a more nuanced appreciation of both resilience and ongoing struggle, revealing the hidden layers of recovery often omitted from simplified historical accounts. Ultimately, the story of recovery is a story of adaptation, endurance, and human ingenuity. Americans emerged from the Depression having learned lessons that extended far beyond finance: the value of community support, the importance of personal and familial resilience, and the limits and possibilities of government intervention. The era also left enduring cultural and historical records, photographs, music, literature, and oral histories, that preserve the lived realities of those years, offering insight into the hidden dimensions of everyday survival, creativity, and courage. These artifacts remind us that history is not only made by policies or institutions but by the countless ordinary acts of endurance, ingenuity, and empathy that sustained people in a time of profound crisis. By examining the final phase of the Depression, we see a nation transformed. The struggles of the previous decade reshaped the American psyche, instilling habits of thrift, solidarity, and self-reliance while highlighting the importance of systemic support. Recovery was both literal and symbolic, a return of jobs, wages, and infrastructure, but also a reclamation of dignity, hope, and identity. The hidden histories of everyday survival, cultural ingenuity, and moral negotiation remain central to understanding the era, revealing that the Great Depression was not merely an economic event but a deeply human experience whose lessons continue to resonate in the way we navigate hardship, community, and resilience today. As the decade drew to a close, the Great Depression left an indelible mark on the American psyche, transforming the way people understood work, community, and survival. It was a period defined not merely by economic statistics, but by human experience, the quiet endurance of families, the ingenuity of children and adults, the solidarity of communities, and the hidden acts of resilience that rarely made the headlines. These stories remind us that history is not simply a collection of numbers, policies, or official narratives, it is written in the lives of ordinary people confronting extraordinary circumstances. From the crowded urban tenements to the barren plains of the Dust Bowl, Americans endured challenges that tested both body and spirit, and their responses continue to teach lessons about adaptability, perseverance, and hope. The Depression also revealed the fragility of social systems and the necessity of human intervention. Government programs like the New Deal provided crucial relief, employment, and infrastructure improvements, yet their reach was never perfect. Millions fell through the cracks, forced to rely on family networks, community support, or personal ingenuity to survive. The interplay between policy and personal action created a dual narrative, one of structural change and one of everyday heroism. Hidden histories from this period reveal the resilience of individuals navigating bureaucratic inefficiencies, social inequality, and moral ambiguity. Acts that might have seemed small at the time, a neighbor sharing food, a family improvising clothing, children inventing games to maintain joy, became essential threads in the fabric of survival, underscoring the profound importance of human agency even amidst widespread hardship. Culturally, the Great Depression left a legacy that continues to resonate. Music, literature, photography, and art chronicled suffering and endurance, preserving the human dimension of this era for future generations. Songs of migration, hardship, and hope captured experiences that statistics alone could never convey. Photographs immortalized faces lined with dust, worry, and determination. Literature gave voice to the struggles of workers, migrants, and families, revealing the emotional and psychological toll of economic collapse. These creative expressions were not only coping mechanisms but also acts of historical preservation, ensuring that the stories of ordinary Americans would not be forgotten. They provide windows into daily life, moments of hidden joy, and acts of defiance that history might otherwise have overlooked, reminding us that even in the darkest times, culture thrives as a form of resilience. The hidden narratives of crime, corruption, and moral compromise also offer essential insight into the human experience during the Depression. Desperation forced difficult choices, blurring lines between right and wrong, and revealing the social complexities of survival. Urban and rural populations alike navigated these challenges with ingenuity and, at times, risk, illustrating that morality in times of crisis is often context-dependent. These stories, often glossed over in mainstream accounts, deepen our understanding of the Depression as more than an economic event. It was a human crucible, testing ethical boundaries, community bonds, and individual endurance. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Great Depression lies in resilience. Families adapted to loss and deprivation, communities innovated to support one another, and individuals found dignity and meaning in survival. Children who grew up scavenging, improvising, and learning adult responsibilities emerged with unique skills and perspectives. Adults who had lost everything rebuilt, often slowly and painstakingly, learning new trades, creating networks of support, and passing lessons of thrift and perseverance to the next generation. Even when systemic structures failed, people found ways to endure, demonstrating creativity, courage, and resourcefulness. These hidden histories, often invisible in official records, reveal the profound human capacity to adapt in the face of relentless adversity. As we reflect on this era, it becomes clear that the Great Depression's impact extends far beyond the 1930s. It reshaped American society, leaving enduring cultural, social, and economic legacies. Policies implemented during this time influenced labor rights, social safety nets, and government intervention for decades to come. Communities forged during hardship maintained bonds that strengthened civic life, and the lessons of ingenuity, solidarity, and emotional resilience became part of the cultural DNA. The Depression reminds us that crisis is both a challenge and an opportunity to understand human behavior, revealing the extraordinary lengths to which ordinary people will go to survive, adapt, and preserve dignity. Ultimately, the Great Depression was more than a period of economic collapse. It was a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and creativity. It was a time when ordinary Americans faced extraordinary challenges, finding ways to survive, maintain dignity, and create meaning in a world stripped of certainty. By examining the hidden histories, everyday struggles, and cultural expressions of the era, we gain a richer understanding of not only the Depression itself but the enduring strength of the human spirit. These stories serve as reminders that even in the darkest times, hope, resilience, and creativity persist, and that history is most vividly remembered in the lives of those who lived it. The Great Depression may have ended decades ago, but its lessons remain timeless. It teaches us about the value of empathy, community, and human ingenuity, about the costs of systemic failure, and about the enduring power of ordinary people to shape their destinies, even amid overwhelming adversity. As we look back, we are not only observing history, we are learning from it, honoring those who endured, and carrying forward their resilience into the challenges of our own time.